talk about fear of failure in a number of different ways, and how inhibiting that can be to creativity and to growth and to the development of something new.
Right.
And you've also talked about cycling some. So I want to see if we can address both of those issues maybe at once. Because one of the things that occurred to me as you were telling the story about your crash was, how did you get back on a bicycle after that? So let me start with that.
Well, it was a slow and painful process. But it was and still is something that I love. I mean, it is, if you were to draw out my circles and say the thing that I do for myself, it is the big thing that I do for myself. Cycling. Both from the standpoint of just health. I mean, I want to be healthy, I want to stay fit, but it's also a great outlet for me. I mean, it helps me to keep stress levels down, and it's a nice, and it's also a time for me to think. I mean, when you're on the bike for 3 or 4 hours, oftentimes by yourself, what are you going to do for 3 or 4 hours on your bike by yourself? You're going to think, and that's a great thing. So I knew that I didn't want to give it up, but it was definitely scary. And friends of mine forced me to go back to that spot within the first year and ride down that hill. And I remember the first time I rode down it, I was like, "Oh my God!" I was scared to death. But you just get back on the bike, so to speak, no pun intended, and it comes back to you.
But you had friends who were helping you to do that.
Yeah, I definitely did. One in particular who he was there that day, and he just was a great, I don't want to say coach, but he was just there. He was a great supporter in terms of getting back on the bike, so to speak. And
so he pushed you despite your fear.
At some level, yeah. And he wasn't pushing me in a way that was overt. He was encouraging. He would say, "Let's go out for a ride." And slowly but surely got back on it. And he signed me up to do a century, almost 1 year to the date of a century is a 100-mile bike ride. Signed me up to do one, literally almost 1 year from the date, and we went and did it together. And it was tough, but it was a great goal to have, and I had that as a goal, and I never looked back.
What else have you learned about leadership and building companies from what you do as a cyclist?
Using that metaphor again of it being a marathon, or in my case, it's a multi-stage race. I think if you look at great athletes, there's a lot of lessons about what makes them successful. Take a guy like Lance Armstrong. He was won the Tour 7 times in a row, unprecedented. Very few people had ever won it 5 times in a row, and he did it 7 times in a row. And he was unique because, here's this race that's 2,500 miles long, raced over 21 days, that is cumulatively about 80 hours of time on the bike, that he has won anywhere from 8 minutes to 1 minute over his rivals. If you think about an 8-minute out of 80 hours, I mean, it's like less than 0.1% difference between him and the next guy. So the margin for error is very, very small. And I think that is the difference between being a champion or not. It is the fact that he prepared meticulously to make sure he had that little edge. And he did that preparation and everything. He had a plan for how he would do a race. He would have a plan for how he prepared. He used to say that the tour is done in July. He would say the tour is won in December. It's won in December because that's when he was preparing.
The prior December.
The prior December.
Obviously.
Yeah. He was preparing in terms of, okay, what did he need to do to win that year? What was the equipment that he needed? He was one of the first people to ever go and actually train on the mountains that they would do the race in every year.
Really? That was an innovation?
It was an innovation. I mean, literally, he would go in May and in June, and he would ride up these, climbs, these 10, 20-mile rides up these climbs. And not just once, by the way. He would do it 4 or 5 times in the same day, with the goal of thinking about, what am I going to do the day of the race? And so taking that idea of having a plan, being prepared, and making sure you have the right pace, those are all things from being prepared for anything, especially being an athlete. Making sure that you have that plan, making sure you're doing all the preparation before you get to the race event, and making sure when you go to the race that you set the right pace. I mean, Lance was very I mean, he knew exactly where he would attack on a mountain stage. And he had that, and so he knew I was going to take it easy up to this point, and then this is the point where I was going to push really hard. And so I think those are lessons that you can take into your, not even just your work life, but your entire life. Do you have a plan? Are you preparing for the things that matter to you? And you're setting the right pace? Those three things were lessons for me that made a big difference.
So are those lessons that you try to convey to the startups that you're advising now?
Absolutely. I always tell everybody, I write a blog, and I recently wrote about this idea of, if you don't know where you're going, then you're lost. And which means if you don't have a plan, and to me a plan is, what are the 3 to 5 wildly important, the most important things that you need to get done? If you as the leader of an organization don't know what they are, then how can you expect anyone to know what they're supposed to be doing? And if you don't know what they are, then it's going to lead to failure. And so I push people really hard to keep it really simple. Make sure you understand what those 3 to 5 things are, and then make sure everyone in the organization understands what those things are. And rally the entire team around those things. Constantly communicate them, and get everybody focused on them. Because I don't think an organization can actually accomplish more than a few big things at a time. And so having that plan is key. And then also being prepared. We, for example, with our sales organization, every night,
you're speaking about it.
Vontu, our sales organization, we bring our sales organization, fly them all in from all around the world every 90 days. Spend 2 to 4 days in San Francisco, where we were based typically, and we would train. We would go through all kinds of simulations. Sitting down with a customer, how do you have a discussion with them? Sitting down with the customer who is an angry customer, how do you have that discussion with them? A happy customer. Because we believed that you had to be prepared. And our salespeople were wildly successful because when they actually sat down with that customer, they knew what to do. They knew what to say. They knew how to deal with it. So yeah, that concept comes into everything about being in a startup.
And are there other ways in which you've brought your passion for cycling into your work life in a way that has been mutually enriching?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of taking lessons about athletics and applying them to your work life. But clearly for me, I enjoy cycling. And one of the things that I've tried to do is, and this was a key idea from your book, to be honest, which was this idea of work-life balance is a really bad idea because it implies a concept of you have to give up something to get something. It's a zero-sum game. So for example, a lot of people will say, well, I can't be in a startup and be physically fit because I don't have the time. Well, my view was, okay, I needed to get to work, so why don't I figure out how to bike to work? And so I started biking to work. So I would get the enjoyment of what I wanted, which was I got to bike for an hour every morning. I figured out how to make that work. I would figure out how to take my clothes to work, and I took a shower near the office, etc. So I figured out how to make it a part of what I needed to do anyway for work. And then I actually tried to bring cycling into the whole work environment with other people. And so
that became a job requirement?
Well, it wasn't a job requirement for everybody, but there were other people there that were athletic, and so I encouraged a group of them to get together, and we created a couple of triathlon teams. So we had swimmers and runners and bikers, and we would get teams of people, and there'd be one person would swim, and I would bike, another guy would run, and then we had a couple of teams, and it became this sort of office competition, and it was lots of fun, and so then we all ended up training together and biking together, and if you're on the bike, oftentimes you're talking about work. So we sort of just blended those things together. And that had an effect, which was I was happier, other people were happier, but it also interestingly created a culture. Because I was a CEO, I was establishing this culture that other people in the company started to create these interesting groups, if you will.
Around their interests.
Around their interests, exactly.
Didn't have to be cycling.
No, people had, I'll call it a tasting group. I don't know what to call it. They typically go out, they would do tastings of champagne. So they did scotch one time and foods. And I wasn't a part of that. I didn't help start it, but it sort of happened naturally because they saw other people doing it, especially the CEO doing it.
So you had people getting drunk instead of doing work. Is that what you're saying, Joseph? Is that what you're advocating for here?
No, I encourage them to find their interests and their passions and to figure out how to blend them into their
Well, how did that help Vontu?
Well, it helped Vontu because it created this camaraderie and this sense of teamwork that, look, when you work, you do spend 2/3 of your waking hours each day during a business day in the office. It is a big benefit if you actually have something in common with some number of people that you work with. I'm not saying you need to be friends with everyone you work with, because that's not going to happen. I mean, I'm realistic about that. But at least if you have relationships with some number of people in the office, that camaraderie will lead to, in my opinion, lead to higher productivity, higher job satisfaction, higher engagement, which will lead to a more successful company. I mean, how can you argue with that?
Well, I wouldn't argue with it, but as you know, many people would have concerns about that, or just don't see how you can mix the different parts of life in a way that is mutually beneficial.
And I think the trick comes back to, if you have a plan and you know how you're going to measure your success, then you don't worry about that kind of stuff. You don't worry about whether people are maybe leaving one day at 4 o'clock to go to a wine tasting. What you care about is, did they deliver the results?
The results.
And if you focus on the objectives and you're clear about those objectives, great teams will rally to achieve them. And if they happen to go out once a month and enjoy some time together, great. If they hit the objectives and they're wildly engaged, it's great. And at Vontu, that happened. I mean, we consistently beat our sales numbers. We delivered massive engineering projects on time at high quality. And our voluntary attrition over a 7-year period of time was less than 5% per year.
How does that compare to the norms in your industry?
To be honest, some large corporations, it's upwards of 15 to 20%. And the other interesting statistic is, after the acquisition by Symantec, typically there's a huge increase in the voluntary attrition. People leave. And in the first 12 months, it was still less than 5%.
What's the attribution you make there?
Well, part of it was, we were still the same team doing the same job. And so they enjoyed what they were doing. And everybody was really afraid. They said, oh my gosh, this great company, Vontu, that we're a part of, now we're part of this big corporation with 18,000 people, everything's going to change. And we tried really hard to say, look, we've got a job to do. Yes, we're part of a larger company. We're going to get some benefits from part of that. But we tried to keep those cultural things that were important, that made us successful, and continue to do that.
Has that been difficult to press, against the larger, cultural imperatives that are naturally going to be different?
The nice thing about Symantec is they've acquired, 30 or 40 companies over the last 10 years.
So they've learned something about how to
They're learning.
ingest.
They're learning.
Okay, got it.
And they're honest about that. And they were honest, and we had a lot of discussions up front about how do we make this thing successful. And we always came back again to the objectives. We said, what do you want to see from Vontu 12 months after the acquisition? And we all agreed on what those were. And so when we started to bump into those things where they were telling us we couldn't do something a certain way, we came back and said, you want us to deliver this result? If you want us to deliver this result, here's how we need to do it.
So it comes down again to clarifying what's really important.
Absolutely.
And getting buy-in to that.